I remember the exact moment my life shattered into 1,000 pieces. It was a Tuesday evening in late October, the kind of evening where the sky turns that bruised shade of purple just before darkness swallows everything whole. I was standing in my childhood kitchen in our family home in Surrey, staring at two police officers who had just placed me in handcuffs for embezzling £73,000 from my father's company. My stepmother, Victoria, stood behind them, tears streaming down her perfectly contoured face, clutching my father's arm as if she needed his support to survive the trauma of what I had allegedly done. But through those tears, for just a split second, I caught something else entirely. A flicker. A glint. The unmistakable shimmer of triumph hiding behind those manufactured sobs. And in that moment, even as the cold metal bit into my wrists and my father looked at me with a devastation I had never seen before, I knew with absolute certainty that Victoria had orchestrated every single second of this nightmare. I just had no idea how deep her deception ran or how long she had been planning to destroy me. Let me take you back to the beginning, to help you understand how I ended up standing in that kitchen, branded a thief by the woman who had spent 3 years pretending to love me like her own daughter. My mother passed away when I was 19 years old. Ovarian cancer. It took her 8 months from diagnosis to funeral, and it left a wound in our family that I honestly believed would never heal. My father, Richard, was destroyed. They had been together for 27 years, childhood sweethearts who built a successful property development company from absolutely nothing. Collins Property Holdings became one of the most respected development firms in the south of England, and my parents had created that empire together, brick by brick, deal by deal. When my mother died, something in my father died too. He threw himself into work with an obsession that frightened me, staying at the office until midnight, refusing to discuss his feelings, slowly becoming a ghost in our own home. I was completing my accounting degree at the time, and I moved back home to be with him. I deferred my final year, took care of the house, made sure he ate actual meals instead of whiskey and cigarettes. For 2 years, it was just the two of us, navigating grief together, slowly finding our way back to something resembling normalcy. I finished my degree, got hired at a mid-sized accounting firm in London, and started building my own career while still living at home to keep an eye on my dad. He was getting better. He smiled more. He mentioned my mother without his voice breaking. He started attending social events again, reconnecting with old friends. And then, he met Victoria. She appeared at a charity gala that one of his business associates had organized. Victoria Hartley, a 40-year-old interior designer who had recently relocated from Manchester following what she described as a painful divorce. She was stunning in that polished, immaculate way that suggested hours of careful maintenance. Perfect blonde highlights, expensive clothes that draped her slender figure just right, a warm smile that seemed to light up whatever room she entered. My father was immediately captivated. I tried to be happy for him. I genuinely did. He deserved companionship, deserved to feel joy again after losing my mother. The first few months of their relationship seemed almost magical to witness. My father laughed again, really laughed. The kind of deep belly laughs I remembered from my childhood. Victoria was attentive and charming, asking me questions about my work, complimenting my career ambitions, telling me how lucky Richard was to have such a devoted daughter. She bought me thoughtful gifts, remembered small details I mentioned in passing, made genuine efforts to include me in their plans. When my father announced their engagement after just 8 months of dating, I pushed down my instinctive hesitation and embraced Victoria with what I hoped was genuine warmth. "I know I can never replace your mother," she said to me that night, holding both my hands in hers, her eyes glistening with what appeared to be sincere emotion. "I would never try, but I hope, in time, you might come to see me as family, as someone who truly cares about you." I believed her. God help me, I actually believed her. They married in a small ceremony the following spring. Victoria moved into our family home, the house my parents had bought when I was 3 years old. The house filled with photographs of my mother, with memories of Christmas mornings and birthday parties and lazy Sunday afternoons. Within weeks, subtle changes began appearing. New furniture replaced pieces my mother had chosen. Photographs were rearranged, some disappearing entirely into boxes that Victoria claimed were just being stored safely. The garden my mother had cultivated with such love was redesigned by a professional landscaper Victoria insisted was long overdue. I told myself I was being oversensitive. Grief makes you territorial about memories, makes you cling to physical objects as if they contain pieces of the people you've lost. Victoria was making the house her own, which was natural and healthy. My father seemed happy with the changes, or at least he didn't object, so I swallowed my discomfort and focused on my own life. I had been promoted at my accounting firm, handling larger clients with more complex portfolios. I was saving money for a deposit on my own flat, planning to move out within the year. My relationship with Victoria settled into something cordial but distant. We exchanged pleasantries at dinner, discussed surface-level topics, maintained the appearance of a functioning family unit. But there was always something slightly off about our interactions, a quality I couldn't quite name. It felt like she was performing warmth rather than actually feeling it, like every kind word was calculated rather than spontaneous. Then, about 18 months into her marriage to my father, Victoria made a suggestion that would ultimately lead to my complete destruction. "Emma, darling," she said over dinner one evening, reaching across the table to touch my hand. "Your father and I were discussing how wonderfully you've been doing at your firm. Your accounting skills are clearly exceptional. We thought perhaps you might consider coming to work at Collins Property Holdings. Richard desperately needs someone trustworthy handling the finances, especially now that the company is expanding into new development projects." My father nodded enthusiastically. "It would mean the world to me, sweetheart. Having you involved in the family business, building something together the way your mother and I did. What do you think?" I hesitated. Working for family could be complicated, boundaries blurring between personal and professional relationships. But the salary they were offering was significantly higher than my current position, the opportunities for advancement were substantial, and the idea of working alongside my father, carrying on my mother's legacy in some small way, was genuinely appealing. I accepted the position 3 weeks later. For the first year, everything seemed perfect. I managed the company's accounts, streamlined financial processes, identified cost savings that improved profit margins by 12%. My father was thrilled with my work, praising me to colleagues and clients, telling anyone who would listen how proud he was. Victoria seemed equally supportive, frequently stopping by my office to bring coffee or ask about my day, playing the role of caring stepmother with apparent sincerity. But something was happening beneath the surface that I was too naive to recognize. Victoria had slowly been positioning herself within the company structure. She started accompanying my father to board meetings, offering opinions on development projects, networking with investors and partners. My father, so deeply in love and so trusting of his new wife, began delegating decisions to her, giving her increasing access to company systems and accounts. She obtained signatory authority on various business accounts, explaining that it was simply practical, allowing her to handle matters when my father was traveling or unavailable. I noticed but didn't object. Victoria was his wife, his partner. It wasn't my place to question how they chose to run their marriage or their business involvement. Looking back now, I can see exactly what she was doing. She was laying groundwork, setting pieces on a chessboard I didn't even know existed, preparing for a game I never agreed to play. The first concrete sign that something was wrong came 6 months before my arrest. I was reviewing quarterly financial statements when I noticed several inconsistencies. Payments to a vendor called Hotley Design Consultancy that I had no record of authorizing. The amounts were relatively small, ranging from £3,000 to £7,000 spread across multiple months. The vendor name immediately caught my attention. Hartley was Victoria's maiden name. I investigated further, accessing payment records and authorization logs. Every single payment to Hartley Design Consultancy had been approved using my login credentials, my digital signature, my authorization codes. But I had never heard of this company, never processed these payments, never approved anything of the sort. My first instinct was to assume a technical error, a glitch in the system that had somehow attached my credentials to transactions I hadn't made. I mentioned it to our IT manager, David, asking him to investigate potential security issues with the financial authorization system. He promised to look into it but seemed unconcerned, assuring me that our systems were secure and suggesting perhaps I had simply forgotten authorizing routine vendor payments. I hadn't forgotten. I knew with absolute certainty that I had never approved those payments, but I also couldn't explain how my credentials had been used without my knowledge. I made the mistake of mentioning my concerns to Victoria. We were having tea in the conservatory, just the two of us, my father away on a business trip to Edinburgh. I brought up the discrepancies casually, framing them as accounting mysteries I was trying to solve, curious whether she knew anything about Hotley Design Consultancy. Victoria's reaction was so brief, so perfectly controlled, that I almost missed it. A fractional tightening around her eyes, a micro-expression of something dark and calculating that vanished so quickly I questioned whether I had imagined it. Then she smiled, that warm, reassuring smile I had grown accustomed to, and shook her head. I'm not familiar with that vendor, darling. Perhaps one of the project managers arranged it. You know how chaotic things can get during development phases. I'm sure it's nothing to worry about. I nodded, accepting her explanation, pushing my concerns aside. But from that moment, Victoria's behavior toward me changed in ways so subtle that only in hindsight can I fully appreciate them. She became slightly more attentive, more present in my daily activities, asking more questions about my work routines, my access to financial systems, my relationships with colleagues. She volunteered to help me with various tasks, offering to lighten my workload by handling certain administrative functions. I see now that she was gathering intelligence, mapping my vulnerabilities, refining whatever plan she had been constructing long before I ever suspected anything was wrong. The second warning sign came 3 months before my arrest, and I was foolish enough to ignore it as well. I received a message from an old colleague at my previous accounting firm, a woman named Sarah who I had remained friendly with after leaving. She mentioned running into someone at a professional conference who claimed to know me, a man named Graham Whitley who said he had worked extensively with Collins Property Holdings on several interior design projects. He was asking quite a few questions about you, Sarah wrote in her email. Wanted to know about your work history, your reputation, whether you'd ever had any issues at previous positions. I thought it was odd, so I wanted to give you a heads up. Is everything okay? I had never heard of Graham Whitley. I searched our company records and found no mention of him, no contracts, no correspondence, no invoices. When I mentioned the name to colleagues, nobody recognized it. When I searched his name online, I found nothing except a bare-bones LinkedIn profile with minimal information and no photograph. This should have alarmed me more than it did. In retrospect, someone was clearly investigating me, building a profile, perhaps searching for ammunition or establishing a narrative about my character, but I convinced myself it was a simple case of mistaken identity, someone confusing me with another Emma Collins somewhere in the world. I filed the incident away in the back of my mind and continued with my normal routine. I continued trusting Victoria, continued working alongside her, continued living in the same house as a woman who was methodically constructing the framework for my complete destruction. The final month before my arrest was when Victoria's trap began closing around me, though I remained oblivious to the tightening noose. It started with small irregularities in my computer access logs. Our IT system showed me logging in at odd hours, 3 in the morning, midnight on weekends, times when I was definitely asleep in my bed or out with friends. I reported these anomalies to David again, more insistent this time that something was genuinely wrong with either the system or my account security. He investigated and found nothing amiss, suggesting perhaps I was logging in from my phone without realizing it, checking emails half asleep and not remembering. I knew that wasn't the explanation, but I couldn't prove otherwise. Then documents started appearing with my signature that I had never signed. Authorization forms for substantial payments, approvals for vendor contracts, financial transfers between company accounts that I had not initiated. When I raised concerns with the accounting team, they seemed confused, showing me timestamps and digital signatures that appeared entirely legitimate, entirely traceable to my credentials and my workstation. I started documenting everything, keeping a personal record of every transaction I legitimately processed, noting dates and times with meticulous detail. I installed a camera app on my personal laptop, recording my home office to prove my whereabouts during certain hours. I was becoming paranoid, questioning my own memory, wondering if I was somehow processing these transactions in states of distraction or exhaustion, and genuinely not remembering. Victoria noticed my increasing stress and used it against me with devastating precision. "Emma, darling, you seem so tense lately," she would say with concerned sweetness. "Perhaps you're taking on too much at work. Your father and I are worried about you. We've noticed you seem distracted, making more mistakes than usual. Maybe you need a holiday." She planted these seeds with everyone. My father mentioned at dinner that Victoria had expressed concerns about my well-being, that she had noticed me becoming erratic and forgetful. Colleagues mentioned Victoria asking them about my mood, my performance, whether they had noticed any changes in my behavior. She was constructing a narrative of instability, of burnout, of someone cracking under pressure. When I look back, I can see every piece of her carefully constructed frame, every brushstroke in the portrait she was painting of me as an unstable, untrustworthy employee capable of betraying her own family, And then came the night everything collapsed. I arrived home from work that Tuesday evening to find my father sitting in the living room with 2 police officers and Victoria perched beside him. Clutching his hand with theatrical distress, an accountant from our company's external audit firm sat across from them, papers spread across the coffee table, his expression grave and uncomfortable. "Emma," my father said, his voice cracking with confusion and pain. "These officers need to ask you some questions. There have been some concerning discoveries regarding the company finances." The external audit had uncovered systematic embezzlement totaling £73,000 over an 18-month period. The money had been funneled through fraudulent vendors, including hotly designed consultancy, into accounts that investigators had traced to my name. Every transaction bore my authorization codes, my digital signatures, my login credentials. Email correspondence arranging these payments had been sent from my company email address. Bank statements showed deposits into an account registered under my name and national insurance number, an account I had never opened, never known existed. I stood there, paralyzed with shock as the police officers explained that I was being arrested on suspicion of fraud and embezzlement. Victoria sobbed convincingly, burying her face in my father's shoulder. My father looked at me with an expression I had never seen before, a devastating mixture of betrayal, confusion, and heartbreak. "Emma, how could you?" he whispered. "After everything we've been through, how could you do this to our family?" "Dad, I didn't do this," I said, my voice shaking, tears streaming down my face. "I swear to you, I have never stolen anything. This is a mistake. Someone is framing me." Victoria's head lifted from my father's shoulder, her tear-stained face a mask of wounded innocence. "Emma, please. The evidence is right there. The auditors have been investigating for weeks. Your father and I didn't want to believe it either, but the proof is undeniable." The proof was indeed undeniable. That was the genius of Victoria's frame. Every piece of evidence pointed directly at me with no apparent alternative explanation. The digital trail was comprehensive, the paper documentation seemingly airtight, the financial transfers meticulously documented with my credentials attached to every step. I was taken into custody that night, fingerprinted, photographed and placed in a holding cell while my world collapsed around me. I called a solicitor, a criminal defense lawyer named Marcus Webb, who my university friend recommended, and spent a sleepless night in a cold room that smelled of disinfectant and despair, trying to comprehend how my life had unraveled so completely in the span of a few hours. My father refused to post bail. That was perhaps the most devastating blow of all. He had the resources, the connections, the ability to secure my release while I awaited trial. But he refused. When Marcus conveyed this to me the following morning, I broke down completely, sobbing in the solicitor's conference room with a grief that felt bottomless. "He said he needs time to process what's happened," Marcus explained gently. "He says the evidence is overwhelming and he can't in good conscience support you until he understands the truth." Victoria had won. In one calculated move, she had destroyed my relationship with my father, stolen my freedom, and poisoned the well of trust that had defined our family for my entire life. But Victoria made one critical mistake. She underestimated me. I was released on bail 3 days later, secured by a former colleague from my accounting firm who believed in my innocence. I wasn't permitted to return to the family home or contact my father directly. I moved into a small flat in southeast London that a university friend had available, a 1-bedroom space above a takeaway restaurant that smelled perpetually of curry and fried food. I had lost my job, my family, my reputation, and my freedom was contingent upon the outcome of a trial that seemed almost certainly destined to find me guilty. Those first weeks were the darkest of my life. I barely ate, barely slept, spending hours staring at walls wondering how everything had gone so catastrophically wrong. The evidence against me seemed insurmountable. Even my own solicitor, while professionally committed to my defense, clearly harbored doubts about my innocence. But there was something that kept me from surrendering completely. A memory that crystallized into certainty the more I examined it. That flicker in Victoria's eyes when the police had arrested me. That split-second glimpse of triumph behind manufactured tears. I had seen it. I knew what I had seen. And that single moment of truth became the foundation upon which I built my entire defense. If Victoria had framed me, she had left traces. No scheme this elaborate could be executed without leaving evidence somewhere. I just had to find it. The first person who truly believed me was Daniel Matthews, a friend from my university days whose father had worked with mine decades ago. Daniel had become a solicitor specializing in corporate fraud, and when he heard about my arrest through mutual connections, he reached out immediately. "Emma, I've known you since we were teenagers," he said when we met at a coffee shop near my temporary flat. "You're the most honest person I've ever known. You used to return extra change when cashiers made mistakes. There's no way you embezzled anything." I showed him everything I had gathered, the documentation of irregularities I had noticed before my arrest, the records I had kept, my timeline proving I couldn't have been logged into company systems at certain times when transactions were processed. Daniel studied the materials with the focused intensity that made him excellent at his job. "Someone had access to your credentials," he said slowly. "Someone who could duplicate your digital signature, access your workstation, create accounts in your name. Who had that kind of access?" We both knew the answer, but saying it out loud felt dangerous. Victoria was still living with my father, still maintaining her position as the grieving wife dealing with the betrayal of her stepdaughter, still controlling the narrative that had destroyed my life. "We need proof," Daniel said. "Solid, irrefutable proof that won't get thrown out of court." "How do I get proof against someone who has had 18 months to cover their tracks?" Daniel thought for a long moment. "The same way you catch any embezzler. You follow the money. Every transaction leaves a trail. If Victoria set this up, there's a destination for those funds that benefits her, not you. We just have to find it." And so began the painstaking process of rebuilding my life while simultaneously constructing the case that would eventually expose Victoria for what she truly was. The first breakthrough came from an unexpected source. 3 weeks after my arrest, I received a letter forwarded from my old address. It was from a woman named Patricia Donnelly in Manchester, Victoria's home city before she relocated south. "Dear Miss Collins," the letter read, "I apologize for contacting you during what must be a difficult time. I read about your situation in an online news article and I recognize Victoria Hartley's name. I believe I have information that might be relevant to your case. My brother was married to Victoria from 2012 to 2019 and he died under circumstances that our family has always considered suspicious. Please contact me if you would like to discuss this further." I called Patricia that same evening, my hands trembling as I dialed her number. What she told me changed everything. Victoria's previous husband, a man named William Donnelly, had been a successful restaurant owner in Manchester. He had met Victoria when she redesigned the interior of his flagship restaurant, and they married after a whirlwind romance that Patricia described with palpable bitterness. "She isolated him from us almost immediately," Patricia explained. "Convinced him that our family was jealous, that we were trying to undermine their relationship." Within 2 years, William had stopped attending family gatherings entirely. He signed over joint ownership of his businesses to Victoria. He changed his will to make her the primary beneficiary, cutting out his own children from a previous marriage. Then William died. A heart attack at age 52, supposedly triggered by stress and overwork. Victoria inherited everything, sold the restaurants, and relocated south shortly afterward. The coroner ruled it natural causes, Patricia said, her voice tight with frustrated grief. But William was healthy. He exercised regularly, ate well, had no history of heart problems. Our family hired a private investigator after his death, but we couldn't prove anything. Victoria was too careful, and by then she had already moved away with all his money. I felt ice spreading through my veins. This wasn't just financial fraud I was dealing with. Victoria was a predator who had done this before, targeting wealthy men, manipulating her way into their lives and finances, then eliminating anyone who stood in her way. I was standing in her way. I had been from the moment my father proposed, from the moment she realized I would inherit the company and the family wealth she had set her sights on. She hadn't killed me. She had done something arguably worse. She had destroyed my reputation, my relationships, my freedom. She had made me into a criminal in the eyes of everyone I loved. Patricia connected me with the private investigator her family had hired, a man named Samuel Cooper who had been searching for evidence against Victoria for years. When I explained my situation, he agreed to help, waiving most of his fees out of a personal determination to see Victoria finally face justice. "She's smart," Samuel warned me during our first meeting. "Smarter than most criminals I've investigated. She plans years in advance, creates alibis, covers every track. If she framed you, she's been setting this up since before she even married your father." "Then how do I catch her?" Samuel smiled grimly. "Everyone makes mistakes eventually. The longer they operate, the more confident they become. Confidence leads to carelessness. Victoria has been getting away with this for years now. She thinks she's untouchable. That arrogance will be her downfall. We developed a multi-pronged investigation strategy. Samuel would dig into Victoria's past, tracing her movements and finances going back decades, searching for patterns in previous victims. Daniel would pursue legal avenues, examining the evidence against me for inconsistencies and procedural errors, and I would do what I did best: follow the money. The accounts opened in my name, the ones where the embezzled funds had supposedly been deposited, were the key to everything. I hadn't opened them, didn't have access to them, couldn't have possibly benefited from their contents. But someone had opened them using my personal information, my national insurance number, forged signatures on application forms. I obtained copies of the bank account applications through my legal defense discovery process. The signatures were good forgeries, close enough to fool a casual observer, but a handwriting expert Daniel hired identified several inconsistencies, suggesting they had been traced from existing samples rather than naturally written. More importantly, the application forms had been submitted in person at a bank branch in central London. Bank records showed the submission occurred on a Tuesday afternoon when I had been in a meeting with 3 colleagues and 2 external clients, an easily verifiable alibi that placed me miles away from that bank. Security footage from the bank had been automatically deleted after 90 days, standard protocol, but the branch had a visitor log and the person who submitted my application had signed in using a name I didn't recognize: Jennifer Walsh. Jennifer Walsh didn't exist. The address given was fake. The phone number disconnected. But I now had a piece of evidence proving I couldn't have opened that account personally, proving someone else had done it using my stolen identity. I began documenting everything I discovered, building a shadow case file that grew thicker by the week. Every inconsistency, every anomaly, every thread that didn't quite fit the narrative Victoria had constructed. Meanwhile, Samuel's investigation into Victoria's past was yielding disturbing results. She had been born Victoria Ann Whitley in Birmingham. Whitley, the same surname as the mysterious Graham Whitley who had been asking questions about me months before my arrest. Samuel traced Graham Whitley to a private investigation firm that had quietly dissolved 6 months earlier. The firm's records were minimal, but financial records showed several payments from an account registered to a company called Hartley Holdings Limited. Hartley, Victoria's maiden name. The same name as the fraudulent vendor through which the embezzled funds had been channeled. Victoria had hired investigators to research me, to understand my work history and reputation, likely searching for vulnerabilities she could exploit or existing character flaws she could amplify. When she found nothing useful, she simply manufactured evidence instead. The web of deception was becoming clearer, but we still needed direct proof connecting Victoria to the fraud. Circumstantial evidence might create reasonable doubt, but I wanted more than an acquittal. I wanted Victoria exposed, destroyed, made to face every consequence of her calculated cruelty. My opportunity came from Victoria herself, delivered unwittingly through her own arrogance. 6 weeks after my arrest, I received an email from my father. It was the first direct communication we'd had since that devastating night, and reading it felt like having my chest cracked open all over again. "Emma," it began, "I don't know what to believe anymore. Victoria has been wonderful, supporting me through this nightmare, but something she said recently unsettled me. She mentioned details about your arrest that I don't remember sharing with her, things that only you and I should have known. I'm confused and I need to understand what happened. Can we talk?" I called him immediately, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped my phone. "Dad," I said when he answered, my voice breaking, "I didn't do this. I swear on Mum's memory, I never stole anything." "I know," he said, and those 2 words released a flood of tears I couldn't control. "Emma, I think I've made a terrible mistake. I think I've been manipulated by someone I trusted, but I need your help to prove it." He explained what had prompted his change of heart. Victoria had made an offhand comment about the specific bank accounts involved in the fraud, mentioning details that hadn't been shared publicly, details that only someone with inside knowledge of the scheme could have known. She had caught herself almost immediately, redirecting the conversation, but my father had noticed. For the first time since my arrest, he had allowed himself to consider the possibility that his daughter was innocent and his wife was a monster. "She has access to everything," my father said, his voice heavy with shame and fear. "Company systems, financial accounts, even my personal documents. If she's behind this, Emma, I've given her every tool she needed to destroy you. Dad, listen to me carefully. Don't confront her. Don't let her know you suspect anything. If she realizes you're questioning her, she'll cover her tracks, maybe even disappear with whatever she can take. We need to catch her properly, legally, in a way she can't escape. My father agreed, and we developed a plan. He would continue acting normally, maintaining the appearance of a devoted husband who believed his daughter guilty. Meanwhile, he would quietly gather evidence, documenting Victoria's access to financial systems, monitoring her communications where legally possible, observing her behavior for any indication of guilt or continued manipulation. Daniel advised us to involve the police investigation, sharing our suspicions with the detectives handling my case. They were skeptical at first, having already built what they considered a solid case against me. But the evidence we presented, the identity fraud at the bank, the connections to Victoria's shell companies, the suspicious death of her previous husband, was compelling enough to warrant additional investigation. Detective Inspector Helen Crawford was assigned to examine our claims. She was a serious woman in her late 40s with sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. I met with her several times over the following weeks, walking her through every piece of evidence I had assembled, every thread that pointed toward Victoria's guilt. "I have to be honest with you, Miss Collins," D.I. Crawford said after reviewing my materials. "What you're presenting is intriguing but not conclusive. We can establish that someone else submitted those bank applications, but we can't prove that someone was Victoria Hartley without additional evidence." "Then help me get that evidence," I said. "She's still living with my father, still operating freely. She thinks she's won. People who think they've won get careless." D.I. Crawford studied me for a long moment. "You want to set a trap. I want justice. If that requires a trap, then yes." The plan we developed was risky but elegant. My father would stage a scenario suggesting that the police investigation was closing in on new evidence that might exonerate me. He would mention this to Victoria in seemingly casual conversation, plant seeds of concern about potential exposure, and observe her reaction. If Victoria was guilty, the news that her frame might be unraveling would force her to act, to cover tracks, to make moves that would reveal her involvement. It was a gamble. If Victoria remained calm and took no action, we would be back to circumstantial evidence and reasonable doubt. But if she panicked, if she tried to destroy evidence or access funds she had hidden, we would have the proof we needed. My father executed his role perfectly. Over dinner one evening, with Victoria pouring wine and maintaining her usual pleasant demeanor, he mentioned casually that my solicitor had filed a motion introducing new evidence that might change the direction of my case. "Apparently, they have proof that Emma couldn't have opened those bank accounts," he said, watching Victoria's face carefully. "Security footage or something. Her lawyer seems confident the charges might be dropped." Victoria's reaction was everything we had hoped for, and more. She didn't panic visibly. She was too controlled for that. Instead, she smiled supportively, expressed hope that the truth would come out, and excused herself to the bathroom a few minutes later. But when she emerged, she announced that she needed to run an errand and left the house at 9 o'clock in the evening with no clear explanation. My father alerted D.I. Crawford immediately. Police surveillance followed Victoria to a storage facility in West London, a unit she had rented under a false name 18 months earlier. She spent 45 minutes inside before emerging with a duffel bag that she loaded into her car. She then drove to a marina along the Thames, where surveillance officers observed her meeting with a man later identified as Kevin Hughes, a disgraced former solicitor with connections to financial fraud networks. She handed him the duffel bag. Police intercepted Kevin Hughes as he was leaving the marina. Inside the duffel bag, they found documents, hard drives, and financial records that Victoria had been keeping as insurance. Detailed records of every fraudulent transaction she had orchestrated, evidence of the shell companies she had created, records of previous schemes that predated her relationship with my father, and most damningly, communications with Kevin Hughes dating back years, establishing him as her long-term accomplice in what appeared to be a systematic pattern of fraud targeting wealthy widowers. Victoria was arrested the following morning. I was sitting in Daniel's office when the call came through, D.I. Crawford informing me that Victoria had been taken into custody and that all charges against me were being dropped. The case against her was overwhelming, built not just on what she had done to me, but on evidence of at least 2 previous fraud schemes she had operated over the past decade. I should have felt triumph in that moment. I should have experienced the satisfaction of justice finally being served, of watching my tormentor face the consequences she had so carefully evaded for so long. Instead, I felt empty, hollowed out by months of fear, grief, and betrayal. My life had been destroyed. My relationship with my father damaged in ways that would take years to heal. My trust in human beings fundamentally shattered. Victoria's trial took place 8 months later. I attended every day, sitting in the public gallery, watching as the prosecutor methodically dismantled her carefully constructed facade. She maintained her innocence throughout, offering alternative explanations, claiming she had been framed herself, playing the victim with the same theatrical skill she had employed when the police arrested me in my own kitchen. But the evidence was irrefutable. Digital forensics proved she had accessed my credentials through a keylogger installed on my work computer, software she had planted during one of her visits to bring me coffee. Bank records traced the embezzled funds through a complex network of accounts, ultimately leading back to holdings she controlled. Handwriting analysis confirmed she had forged documents. Phone records showed her communications with Kevin Hughes and other accomplices. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before finding her guilty on all counts: fraud, embezzlement, identity theft, conspiracy, money laundering, and pending investigation into the death of William Donnelly, potential charges of manslaughter or murder that prosecutors in Manchester were actively pursuing. Victoria was sentenced to 12 years in prison. I was present in the courtroom when the judge delivered the sentence. Victoria stood in the dock, her expensive clothing replaced by standard prison attire, her perfectly maintained appearance diminished by months of incarceration. For the first time since I had known her, she looked ordinary, small, human. As she was led from the courtroom, she turned and looked directly at me. There was no triumph in her eyes this time, no hidden flicker of satisfaction. There was only hatred, pure and undisguised, the true face that had always lurked behind her manufactured warmth. I held her gaze without flinching. I wanted her to see that she hadn't broken me, that despite everything she had done, I was still standing. "You took everything from me," I said quietly, not caring whether she could hear me. "But I'm still here, and you're not." The months following Victoria's conviction were dedicated to rebuilding what had been destroyed. My relationship with my father required the most careful reconstruction. He was devastated by guilt over having believed Victoria's lies, over having abandoned me when I needed him most. I won't pretend I wasn't angry. There were nights I couldn't speak to him, days when the memory of him refusing to post bail, refusing to believe in my innocence, felt like a wound that would never fully heal. But he was my father. He was the man who had raised me, who had loved me unconditionally before Victoria poisoned everything between us. He was as much her victim as I was, manipulated by a predator who had studied human psychology and exploited it with clinical precision. Family therapy helped. Honest conversations, no matter how painful, helped more. Slowly, incrementally, we found our way back to each other. The company required rebuilding as well. Victoria had done significant damage to Colin's property holdings during her time in control, extracting funds, neglecting relationships, making decisions that prioritized her interests over the company's sustainability. I returned to work as the head of financial operations, dedicating myself to repairing the damage and establishing systems that would prevent anyone from ever exploiting our vulnerabilities again. But the deepest reconstruction was internal, rebuilding my sense of self, my ability to trust, my belief that the world contained more good than evil. Daniel was instrumental in that process. Our friendship had deepened through the months of crisis into something more profound. A connection built on mutual respect, shared struggle, and unwavering loyalty. When he finally told me he had feelings for me, feelings that had apparently existed since our university days but had never seemed appropriate to express, I wasn't surprised. I was ready. We took things slowly, building a relationship on solid foundations rather than dramatic gestures. We communicated openly about fears and vulnerabilities, established trust through consistent actions rather than promises. 2 years after Victoria's conviction, Daniel asked me to marry him during a quiet walk through the park where we had spent so many hours planning my defense. I said yes without hesitation. Our wedding was small, intimate, held in the garden of the family home that had been the site of so much pain but was slowly being transformed into something new. My father walked me down the aisle, tears streaming down his face, holding my hand as if he would never let go again. "Your mother would be so proud of you," he whispered as we reached the altar. "I know I've let you down, Emma, but I promise, for whatever time I have left, I will spend it earning your forgiveness." "You already have," I told him. "You believed me when it mattered most. You helped me catch her. That's what I'll remember." Victoria appealed her conviction twice, both attempts rejected by the courts. The investigation into William Donnelly's death resulted in additional charges. While prosecutors couldn't prove murder, they established a pattern of financial abuse and manipulation that contributed to his declining health. Victoria received additional sentences that extended her incarceration well into her 60s. I heard through the investigation grapevine that other potential victims had come forward after her conviction. People from her past who had been too afraid or too unsure to speak out before. Victoria's pattern of predation apparently stretched back much further than anyone had initially realized. A lifetime of manipulation and exploitation finally brought into the light. Sometimes I wonder what created her. What childhood trauma, what fundamental flaw in her psychology led her to view other human beings as nothing more than resources to be exploited and discarded. There must be a story there, some explanation for the cold emptiness at the center of her soul. But honestly, I've stopped caring about her story. I spent too many months with my life revolving around Victoria, thinking about her, fearing her, planning her destruction. Now I choose to think about the future instead, about the life Daniel and I are building together, about the company I'm helping to grow, about the family I'm slowly, carefully repairing. I won't pretend the experience didn't change me. I'm more cautious now, slower to trust, more attuned to the subtle signs of manipulation that I once overlooked. I watch people more carefully, looking for the flicker behind the smile, the calculation behind the kindness. But I refuse to let Victoria's cruelty define me. She wanted to destroy me, to break me so completely that I would never recover. Instead, she made me stronger, more resilient, more determined to protect myself and the people I love. The truth came out. Justice was served. The woman who framed me for something I didn't do is spending her remaining years in prison, stripped of the wealth she had accumulated through deception, isolated from the society she had manipulated so effectively. And I am free. Not just legally free, though that matters more than I can express. I am free from the fear that haunted me, free from the self-doubt that made me question my own memories and perceptions, free from the shadow that Victoria cast over every aspect of my existence. Some people might call what happened to Victoria karma, others might call it consequences, justice, or simply the inevitable result of a lifetime of choices catching up with her. I call it truth. The truth I knew in my bones from the moment those handcuffs closed around my wrists. The truth I fought for through months of investigation and reconstruction. The truth that set me free and condemned my stepmother to the fate she had tried to engineer for me. Victoria framed me for something I didn't do. She nearly succeeded in destroying my entire life, but in the end, the only life she destroyed was her own. I think about that night sometimes, the night she was arrested, the night the police finally saw through her carefully constructed facade to the predator lurking beneath. I think about the expression on her face when she realized that everything she had built, every lie she had told, every scheme she had orchestrated, was collapsing around her. I don't feel satisfaction when I remember that expression. I feel something closer to sorrow, grief for the person my father thought he was marrying, the family we thought we were building, the trust that she exploited so thoroughly. But then I look at Daniel, at my father, at the life I've managed to create despite everything Victoria tried to take from me. And the sorrow fades, replaced by gratitude for the people who stood by me, for the strength I discovered within myself, for the justice that was ultimately served. My mother used to say that the truth always comes out eventually, that lies, no matter how carefully constructed, eventually collapse under their own weight. I didn't always believe her. The world seemed too complicated, too unfair, too full of people who got away with terrible things. But she was right. The truth did come out, and Victoria, for all her intelligence, for all her careful planning, for all her years of successfully exploiting vulnerable people, couldn't outrun it forever. Neither can anyone else who builds their life on deception and manipulation. That's the lesson I carry forward, the wisdom I've extracted from the worst experience of my existence. The truth matters. Justice matters. And no matter how dark things seem, no matter how thoroughly trapped you feel, there is always a path forward for those who refuse to surrender. Victoria thought she had won when she stood behind those police officers in my kitchen, manufacturing tears while I was led away in handcuffs. She thought she had eliminated the obstacle standing between her and my father's wealth, his company, his remaining years of life that she planned to exploit and control. But she hadn't won. She had simply started a countdown to her own destruction, triggered by the single moment when she couldn't quite hide the triumph flickering behind her tears. I saw that flicker. I held onto it through the darkest nights, and eventually, it led me to everything I needed to bring her down. Now I'm the one standing in the family kitchen, but there are no police officers, no handcuffs, no manufactured tears. There's just me and Daniel preparing dinner together, my father sitting in the conservatory reading his newspaper, and the quiet satisfaction of a life rebuilt from the ashes of someone else's cruelty. Victoria is in prison, I am free, and they